Good morning, fellow ruminators, and welcome back to another session of Rumination with Andrew. It is my distinct pleasure to be here with you one more time to discuss a very important topical matter. Now, this is something that we need to be aware of because our politics is sort of going crazy, right? And I was reading an article yesterday from the Guardian newspaper, and it talked about, Nikki Haley's. It says here that Nikki Haley declines to say slavery was cause of the U.S. Civil War. Now, that is an interesting sort of, title for an article. Now, what if she does decline to admit that slavery was the cause of the Civil War? You know, how is that important to us right now? And why is the media creating this fluff over what she said and did not say about slavery, right? The fact that she did not include slavery in her response, you know, does not mean that she perhaps does not believe that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. She may as well as she may not, right? The fact of the matter is that that is not the substantive information and newsworthy items that we would, or we should be talking about, that we should be engaged in at the moment. At the moment, we should be talking about the military-industrial complex, right? Because that is the organization that is just about to enslave all of us, right? Whether you are of European heritage or African heritage or Asian heritage, the military-industrial complex is on a rampage to enslaving all of us. And I think that to some extent, we have already been enslaved, right? But we are not talking about these things. We're talking about matters that do not pertain to the times in which we live. Is slavery important? Of course it is. Should we learn the truth about slavery? Of course we should. But at this moment, nitpicking, and we know that both these, political parties are controlled. We do not need them to preach to us in terms of what is right and what is wrong. Because I think that both parties, both US parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican parties, are morally corrupt. And they are also working for the military-industrial complex. So there are two wings of the same bird. And that is what needs to be discussed and need to be understood. They're controlled by private corporations, by these large corporations who sponsor their campaigns. And remember now that persons like Joe Biden, like Nikki Haley's, like the Donald Trumps of the world, they have to say what their constituents want them to say. And there are many Americans who believe that slavery was not the principal cause of the Civil War. A lot do. Even those who are pretending like they want to, ascribe the Civil War to slavery. Many of them in their inner beings, if we could read the heart as God can, would realize that they believe too that slavery could not have been the main cause of the Civil War, because many Americans see Black people as inferior, right? And they do not want to know that, Black people were at the center. The issues of Black people were at the center of the Civil War, right? It was W.E.B. Du Bois who brought that to the fore and said this theory of the lost cause was a myth, right? And that had it not been for Black people during the Civil War, the United States might have lost its entire experiment, right? You and I would not have grown up to see this country in operation, right? So yes, Black people and slavery, we can say were at the center of the Civil War, right? There is no doubt about that, right? But at this moment, at this juncture of our history, the slave masters, right, have been supplanted by the military-industrial complex, right? These are our overlords. These are our new slave masters, and we've got to understand that. and the people who sit on Wall Street and their large corporations. They are the new slave masters, the new overlords. And they control people like Nikki Haley's and the Donald Trumps and the Joe Bidens and the Barack Obamas of the world. Right? Do you, the fact of the matter, but let's go into the article. Let's not, digress from what we are about. Now, Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley declined to specify that slavery was a cause of the Civil War on Wednesday, right? Wading into an area of history that continues to reverberate and in some ways define U.S. politics nearly 150 years after it concluded. Now, that is interesting. So she decides not that she does not want to acknowledge that. Now, let's look at this US document. I should have read this to you before I went into the article, but let's, it's not too late. Better late than never, right? Now, this is coming from this website, constitution.congress.gov. And this is of course, it's an intimation, a declaration of the US amendment, First Amendment, right? That is amendment to the Constitution, right? And the First Amendment says, and I read thus, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So here we have in the First Amendment, right? First of all, religion is mentioned, and I do not think that that was done, coincidentally. I think they thought this through, that if you're going to have a free society, you've got to ensure that you have freedom of religion, right? Well, for the most part, the United States does have and practice to some extent, to a great extent, give them their credit, freedom of religion. It's waning now, but it's still there. And what they did during the pandemic was horrendous, but to some extent, we can say it's still there, even though there are forces behind the scenes fighting against that. And that is going to be for another video, not for this video. So the founding fathers understood that freedom of expression is necessary if you're going to have a functioning democracy, right? A functioning Republican state. Now, by Republican state, I don't mean the Republican Party, right? I mean that everybody should have a right, including minorities, at least to air their views. Not everybody's right can be honored, right? But at least they should be able to air what is on their consciences, right? So the fact that I give you the opportunity as a teacher to air your opinions, to voice your opinions, to vocalize your thoughts, does not mean that I agree with them. It just means that I've given you that platform to do so, so that, especially if we're having a debate, right? And politics really deal with debates, right? That's what we do to convince the electorate that that person is the best candidate, right? So it's okay if they sometimes say things that are rooted in error. Should they be corrected? Absolutely, they should be corrected. But if that's what they believe, we ought not to force them. We ought not to coerce them to believe otherwise, right? But we should educate as much as possible, and the state should not try to explicate or to explain to us what we should believe in or not believe in, right? The citizens should be educated enough to listen to their political opponents and those persons whom they are supporting and make an intelligent decision, right? So let us say, for example, the whole aspect of slavery and the US Civil War, then perhaps Americans should now go back to their history books and begin to read about the Civil War, right? And see what really was behind it, and if slavery was indeed the central focus of that war, right? Should not be that the state is telling us what we should believe or not believe, right? It is the right, again, of the politician, even if politicians want to say that they are pro the Holocaust and they saw nothing wrong with the Holocaust. It is offensive, but it is the freedom, it is freedom of speech. And that is a fundamental right in the United States, right? And, years ago when I was in graduate school, I saw that right being whittled away, where you need to have a certain narrative. And if you weren't expressing a certain narrative, you could not get your degree. Because if the professor doesn't believe that narrative, then of course your degree is not going to be, worth reading or worth publishing, right? And that is not what freedom of speech is all about. Once you can back up your arguments, right, and you can use compelling evidence to do so, then you ought to be given that chance. Now, so I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Let's go back to the article with Nikki Haley. Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, where the first shots of the North-South conflict were fired by Confederate soldiers in April 1861, was asked by a New Hampshire voter about the reason for the war, but didn't mention slavery in her response. Instead, Haley talked about the role of government, replying that it involved basically how the government was going to run and the freedoms of what people could and couldn't do. Now, what she says is not wrong too. Yeah, because slavery was also about the operation of the government and the private sector, right? And what role, because essentially the private industry, which was slavery, because slavery was an industry, was a large corporate industry, right? We can agree to that. But that corporation controlled the government, right? And if you read the history of the Civil War, you will see the fights, the physical fights in Congress, where the Southerners thought that they run the show, right, in Washington, and that the Northern people who, they of course, the Northerners had a more industrial base, but, these slave masters had loads of money, loads of economic resources, and they wanted to control everything in Congress. And all the laws that were made, they ensured that slavery remained intact, right? So we have to understand that. But yes, when the Civil War occurred, they had to determine what role and how much, responsibility, how much the government should be expanded, all right? And should it be that it had more responsibilities than it had before the Civil War? These were some of the questions that they had to answer. Now, and they asked, and they did also require the expansion, significant expansion of government responsibilities. Now, this is what Haley is saying, that's Nikki Haley. I think it always comes down to the role of government and what the rights of the people are, and we will always stand by the fact that I think that the government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people, said Haley at a town hall event in Berlin, New Hampshire. Now, one of the things that we need to understand, politicians are not there to say the truth, right? So perhaps we don't know if Nikki Haley thinks that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War or the principal cause of the Civil War, right? Her responsibility as a politician, and I'm not saying that's what she should do, but that is the reality, is to say what her political audience want her to say, her political constituents want her to say, right? She's representing a specific constituent, right? So she is going to say what they want her to say, what they want to hear, and that is what she's doing, right? These are the tactics, the political tactics, the strategies that they use, and not necessarily because they believe, we call them talking points, right? The Democratic Party also has its talking points, right? Where it will say that there's no difference between a man and a woman, right? And that abortion is okay and should be done at the person's whim, right? But the fact of the matter is that that is what they do, right? If they want to get your votes, right, they have to tell you what you want to hear. And most of the times they don't believe anything or some of the things that they say, right? But that is what politics is all about. They have to sell these ideas and these ideologies and these philosophies to you, the public. Now, it is for you to understand and to look beneath the rubbish of what most of these politicians are saying. But you fail to do that, right? You are more so inclined to reading these newspapers and not thinking for yourselves, and allowing the journalists to think for you, right? But if you understand how politics run, then you would understand that Nikki Haley is just, using words, right? And trying to please her political constituents. Now, it was never meant to be all, yeah, I think I read this before. So one of the things that we must understand is that these people are not representing you, as I've said. They are representing the military-industrial complex. America is an empire, and the military-industrial complex controls all the presidents. In fact, Chalmers Johnson describes the American presidency as a pentagonized president or presidency, and also as the imperial president, right? You can't have an imperial president and have freedoms or maintain, as it were, your freedoms. Impossible. The two cannot cohere. And when Americans understand that, then they'll begin to understand what's going on in Washington. Apart from that, you won't be able to understand what's going on. Now, when we look at the whole matter of what is happening in the United States, and they call themselves the exemplars of democracy, you don't find these infantile discussions happening in the third world. They call themselves a first world country, but you don't find these things happening in the third world, as much as their democracy is also in crisis, right? Because, people are free to express themselves, right? For example, in Santo Domingo, and you have the faction which are anti-Haitians, and you have another faction who thinks that, the Haitian contributes or makes his contribution, his or her contribution to the Dominican economy. But the persons on the right who are anti-Haitians, for the most part, they have their voices and they have their protests and they make their outlandish statements about Haitian immigrants to this country, right? But that is how democracy functions, right? And most of the times, both sides are exaggerating. They are using a lot of hyperbolic expressions to deceive you, the public. And it is for us to understand that. It is for us to dissect every word that they use, all the rhetorics that they hurl at us. Now, look at this newspaper, and this is an editorial by the Guardian newspaper, and this was dated, December 28th, yesterday, right? And look at what the Guardian newspaper, the editor of the Guardian newspaper is saying. The Guardian view on a second Trump presidency, things could only get worse. Not the increase of the military-industrial complex and the fact that the United States is investing billions of dollars while lots of people are dying or are not receiving the care that they need, whether the educational care or their health care, right? Because all of those funds have to be diverted to the military-industrial complex, right? To wage wars against innocent people and to kill them. Because that is what it is all about. And this should be the discussion that they're having now, and the media should be unearthing, should be unmasking, should be unveiling all of these truths, but they are just using some little childish, infantile, the president at Harvard University. she plagiarized. If we were to look at the number of people in the American educational system and the education system by extension, and how many of them have plagiarized, we would be shocked, right? All of them, or most of them, because really and truly, there's no real, we can't say that there is any original thought. Pretty very few, right? Most of us have just really, added upon used ideas of people and we twisted their ideas to suit our purposes. And then we say that's original, right? But if the truth be told, right? And that is why when the disciples, not the disciples, the Pharisees came to Christ, right? And they wanted Mary to be stoned because she was found in sin, the act of adultery, right? Christ looked at them and said, those of you without sin, cast the first stone. And I would say to those people who are criticizing Claudine Gay, and not because I'm not pro Claudine Gay, I don't even know her. I just heard about her because, when she became president of Harvard University, but I don't know anything really about Claudine Gay. But I can look at the newspapers and I can look at the superficiality of American news reporting and see that this is just nonsense, right? And they're talking about merit and whether some people got their positions just because they belong to a minority race. That is nonsense, right? Because we know that lots of so-called white Americans do not get positions based on meritocracy, if the truth be told, right? A lot of them get into Harvard and these top universities because of the family connections and because of the amount of money that they have. And recently, I think it was in 2008, not 2008, but 2018. I beg your pardon. Sometimes I mix up these years, right? 2018. Let me be clear here that the American newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, were carrying news stories of how the Chinese, these wealthy Chinese students, were getting into Stanford University, bribing the university, paying them huge sums of money, including, having third party, admissions to, write their papers and to write their, what you call it, their statements, their personal statements and so forth and so on, that they could get into the university. And many of them did, paying the university huge bucks, right? So we know that the United States is not built on meritocracy, as she says. It is. Now, we can say some meritocracy, but for the most part, especially for what they deem to be the white race, right? Because there's no race, right? That is a social construct. It's a socio-political construct, right? But let us say, because we're functioning in that false world, let us say that there is, right? The fact of the matter is that many white people, and not to talk about, and I attended Howard University, and that's a predominantly Black university. And the lots of professors, white professors there, some of whom would not have made it to white universities, right? And the university takes them. Not based on meritocracy also, it was based on fulfilling the whole inclusion and diversity laws, right? The students that get, scholarships that Black people deserve, lots of white children come there, among other ethnic groups, right? And they get full scholarships, right? So when they're behaving as if, because, what's her name? Claudine Gay is the first Black president of Harvard University, that she is, and they're trying as best as possible to berate her as a scholar, as an intellectual, right? But if they should look at many of the so-called white people, they would understand that, they are not as scholarly as they think they are too, right? Because that is this sort of impression that they would like to give us, that the minority people in the United States, who sometimes are way ahead of the so-called white population in terms of brilliance and scholarship, right? Often not said, because the media don't want us to understand that. What they want to paint the picture of, and then they talk about now, oh, she should have said slavery. She should have said slavery. Yeah. Now, do you think the Guardian newspaper cares about Black people, or the Washington Post, or the New York Times? They don't. So why aren't they nitpicking at something about whether or not Nikki Haley should, you know, include the word slavery or not, right? How is it going to change the price of bread in Washington, right? How is it going to dismantle the military-industrial complex, whether the war was fight over slavery or not, right? But this is what the media is doing. So they're giving us this impression that Trump is going to be a very dangerous president. I mean, when he was in the presidency, that's what they said. And Trump did nothing that was unusual of the office, right? He did what all the other presidents did, right? He used a lot of drones, right? He attempted to invade Venezuela, right? He killed that Iranian top general, I forgot his name, in January. Was it January 2021? Right? When that Iranian general was killed. So he was proud, and Trump is proud of this sort of dictatorship of the US presidency, because it's an office and it has an enormous amount of power that it shouldn't have, but it does have. Over the years, it has been able to amass that power to itself, right? And with the complicity of Americans, because they all they want to do is to shop and to watch television and to talk nonsense, if the truth be told. If Americans were really analyzing their politics in the way it should be analyzed, and reading important books. They read, but they're not reading important books. And if they do read, they want to be tethered to a particular narrative. You're liberal or you're conservative. Now, what does that mean? Right? It means nothing to the politicians, because they're neither liberal or conservative, if truth be told. They're politicians, and they're selling to you a product. It's just like a doctor. When you go to a doctor, sometimes you don't need the medicine that he's giving to you, he or she is giving to you, right? But they represent the pharmaceutical industry, and they get their their bonus, their profits from the pharmaceutical industries, from big pharma, right? So they have this responsibility to sell drugs to you. And if you're idiotic enough, you are going to accept it, because you believe that they mean, they have your interest at heart. They have your best interest at heart. And I'm not saying that there might not be few of them who do. So don't go now and say that all doctors are selling you, medicines that you don't need. A lot are. And I would say most are, because that's the nature of their jobs. And remember now that they are, they have huge debts that they have to pay back. And they have to function within a system that is corrupt, that is morally bankrupt. And that is what you have to understand. And the politicians are doing the same thing, right? They are functioning in a system that is controlled by the military-industrial complex, right? So they have to divide you. One of the hallmarks of all empires is that they must divide you. They must polarize you first before they can conquer you, before they can take away your freedoms. And right now, we're seeing that drama happening in America, where the populace is polarized. And what is frightening about it is that many people do not understand that. They think this is business as usual, but it is not. Now, hear this. So among the things that the arguments that they've given why Trump is going to be one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous president that the United States has ever seen, is that he likes to be a dictator. And he has expressed that. Trump is a narcissist, and like most of us are, right? We all have degrees of narcissism. I've always said that, right? We do think a lot of times that the world revolves around us. And that is why people think that there's no God too, because we think that you or somebody else, the world revolves around us. But if we understand that the world revolves around God, right, the universe revolves around him, then we wouldn't think about ourselves and we would give praise to God. The more we think about God essentially is the less we think about ourselves. Right? And that's why we get depressed, because we think about what people say about us, what they do to us, what if we were to think more of praising God and giving glory to him and expressing our gratitude to him? Do you know that whatever men do us and they say to us, we would not be so bothered, right? And get down and get, mean-spirited. We wouldn't, but because we are so much concerned about ourselves, the selfishness, selfish, and self there, it's selfish, which means that you're thinking about yourself or yourselves. And a lot of politicians are selfish, right? They're selfish individuals. They only want power. And that's what they're looking for, not to render a proper service to their constituents. And you've got to understand that, right? Now, the thing about Trump and his expression, his desire to become a dictator, it's what the US presidency endows him with, bequeaths upon him, right? Because that's what it is. It is an imperial office, and it is a dictatorial office, if you will, right? Whatever it says to the world will have to follow, or she will, or the world will face the consequences of US wrath and US military wrath. And that is whatever country that might be, right? The United States is on a quest, right, for full spectrum dominance, right? And that is no simple word. The full spectrum dominance is what it is. They want to control the world, okay? And that is what dictators do, right? So if anything, we could say that the United States is the greatest military dictatorship that the world has ever seen, right? It is not a democracy, right? As they would like us to think. Now, look at this story coming from the Huffington Post, right? And the Huffington Post is, well, it's a Huff Post. I think it was Huffington, but it's Huff Post that we have here. I beg your pardon. Now, this says here, the president gets his wish. He's the dictator. And this article was not written during Donald Trump's presidency, right? It was written during the presidency of George W. Bush. The president gets his wish. That's the title of the article. He's the dictator, right? And here's what Bush is saying. And he said this on December 18th, 2000. That's when I guess he was in office, right? Was he in office in 2000? Yes, he was. Or I think he came to office in 2001. You could correct me there. Now, if this were a dictatorship, it would be a heck of a lot easier, just so long as I'm the dictator, right? So this is what George W. Bush was saying, not Trump. So you understand. And perhaps if we should go and research a lot of statements made by the previous presidents of the United States, particularly in the 21st century, right? We would see where they have mentioned that they are in fact dictators and they love it. They love it. On Tuesday, October 17, 2006, President Bush signed the Military Commissions Act. And now you and I live under the rule of an official dictator who, in his latest press conference, pronounced the word intransigence as intransigence. Now, whatever that is. In other words, now that habeas corpus has been suspended, And the chief executive, that is the president, they call it the chief executive, can personally greenlight torture, meaning that they can torture you. You and I are now ruled by the direct whim of the most knee-jerk, incompetent, and unqualified president in American history. Now, this is what the Americans were saying about the president in 2006, right? And this was written by, of course, a journalist from the press, from the mainstream media. But at that time, certainly, you didn't have CNN creating this sort of, furore and, he's the worst president and all of that nonsense, right? We saw that during the Donald Trump presidency. And you have to ask yourself the question, what is that about? What is behind this agenda? Why did they attack the president of Donald Trump in 2016, even before he began his presidency? By launching a lot of allegations about him, which, in the future were deemed to be false. Why would the media do that? Shouldn't the media be the ones to examine, right? So give the person a fair chance. He was elected president of the United States in 2016, right? Then they should watch him. And then they should assess dispassionately and objectively his presidency. Before he even began his presidency, or on the day that he began his presidency, right? The US media, the left-wing media particularly, began to they began to disseminate all conspiracy theories about the man. And we don't have to like this man, right? To understand that that was unfair to him. And that if you are going to begin the man's presidency by declaring him as this terrible being, right? That the world has ever seen, that the US people have ever seen. Then how are you going to be able to not say that this is going to affect democracy? Because certainly there are people who voted for him. And in a democracy, what should we do? We should respect people on the opposite side who share a different perspective, right? And if the college, what they call it again, that the college, the word has eluded me right now, the electoral college, right? If the electoral college could have given him that win, because the electoral college was the college that gave him that victory when Trump won in 2016, then he played by the rule, right? He played by the rule and he won the election. You and I might not find him or might not have found him to be the most effective president. Same thing could be said about Obama. Same thing could be said about George W. Bush and Joe Biden, right? But it is right. And that is why, we have to be careful what we do to people, because people tend to be revengeful, right? And they will come back and try to, to avenge. And I think Trump is trying to come back to power because he wants to castigate. He wants to come back with full vengeance for what the media and some of his political rivals have done to him. Is that good? No, but that's a game that the opposition people are playing too with him right now, right? And the more they are casting stones at him, the more he's, getting more powerful. And they have to use other tactics. So this morning I woke up and I heard that, that in Massachusetts and another state also is trying to put him off the ballot, following the act of Colorado, right? And I'm saying, where is this democracy leading to? This is not going to end well, right? This is not what an intelligent democracy in which intelligent people reside looks like. This is more of a fourth world democracy, a banana republic, if you will, right? And Americans have got to open up their eyes and see that this is not usual. It is not normal to be nitpicking about what people say and words that they left out and so forth and so on. It's almost like, during the pandemic, right? If I weren't pro-vaccine, it means pro the COVID vaccine, that is. It means that I'm anti-science. You're conflating these two, things, right? I might not like, let's say I'm Republican. I might not like Donald Trump, or I might not like George W. Bush. But it doesn't mean that I'm not an anti-Republican party. It means that, therefore, that I do not like the method of the men. It has nothing to do with the fact that I do not like the party itself. And I'm not Republican or Democrat. I don't have any of that sort of persuasion, right? I am just a person who analyzes politics for what it is. And we have to understand that whatever decisions are made and whatever people allow politicians to do, and when they make these laws, there is no turn back. There is no turning point, right? So the laws that were passed by Bush when he, the Military Commission Act, right, where they say that that was the end of habeas corpus. It means, therefore, that the president can torture you without having any compelling evidence against you. Because if they deem you a terrorist, including US citizens, yeah, including you, right? That they can come to your homes if they deem you to be a terrorist and torture you. We've got to take stock. I think that we are playing games here. I think we need to understand that there is no true Democratic or Republican camp, right? They deem us to be slaves. And by the way, the North, really, who said that the war was about slavery, most of them believed in slavery, right? Most of the Northerners believed in slavery, including their leaders. The contention was, one, saving the Union. It was not Abraham Lincoln's desire to have the United States destroyed over this contentious matter, right? The second factor was the fact that the Northerners, because you have competition in the economic realm, and the Southerners, because they had slavery and they didn't have to pay for labor, that they had enriched themselves disproportionately, right? And the Northerners understood that more power lied in their hands, in the hands of the Southerners. And there was this battle. This was a big battle. So the war was being fought over, really, the accumulation of wealth by these two great economic powers, the Northerners and the Southerners, which splitted the United States into two countries, really, literally, right? And these elites were fighting over who would gain the preeminency, the supremacy, to run the United States. They weren't concerned about the citizens and the citizens' rights. If truth be told, later in the war, Abraham Lincoln, if you read the book 50 Years in the Catholic Church, right? I think it's for 50 years in Rome, I think, right? Where the priest was able to unmask what was happening to, what's his name? Abraham Lincoln. And he told him that the Jesuits were behind the war, and that this war was not a natural war. And there were outside forces, and even Britain was contemplating whether or not they would invade the United States and take back the country that they had lost some years before, right? So we have to understand that these situations are not as simple as we put it. Oh, it's over slavery, and that's it. There are many other issues at stake, right? Including powers that wanted to reclaim their preeminency and their supremacy, like Britain, and including the Vatican, right? So, engaging in verbal spats, in verbal combats about, what the US Civil War was about or was not about, is at this point ludicrous. I think we have a situation in which the military-industrial complex does not want to really be unmasked fully yet. So what she does, or what that institution does, it controls the media, it controls the government, it controls just about everything that happens in the United States, including academia. So they have to, choose and select items in the news that are not newsworthy and have you know, the little slaves in the United States argue over these matters, right? Not looking, not examining the substantive issues that are at play, right? Do you think that the United States can continue to go around the world killing innocent lives and think its citizens will go scot-free, right? Just read the pages of history. And if we are going to look also at the US Civil War, we understand that blood was on the hands of US citizens and their leaders, the blood of people of African descent, and Abraham Lincoln and lots of other leaders who at the time had more inclination to religion. At least they perhaps were not religious themselves, but the American society was a more religious society at the time, right? And they had much clarity of understanding. Today we don't, because Americans have decided to give up on religion for the most part, right? So they don't have clarity of thought, right? But if we were to look at that particular war, they knew, and they said it in many times, on many occasions, that this was a direct judgment of God for what they did to their African brothers and sisters, right? Because they are Americans. There's no white and black race, as I've said before. We are a part of a human family. The Bible says, and I think it came from Acts 17, verse 26, from one blood, not from many different types of blood. Yes, we have different types of blood, but it is one blood. And that is why when the so-called person from Europe wants blood, if his blood type matches with a person from Africa, it can be given because he's a human being. What is this nonsense about your white and whiteness depicts a certain type of personality, or blackness depicts a certain types of personality? It's nonsense, idiocy, stupidity, right? And Americans have got to grow up. This understanding of race and racism and all these, spurious theoretical understandings are destroying the country, right? And we've got to understand that. We've got to look back at the science. There was a geneticist coming from, UK geneticist, I forgot his name, but he was on YouTube. I think he's now deceased, but, he had his video recorded some years back. And he says, having done many years of research in the southern parts of the United States, in the South, right? That 90%, over 90% of what we call the white race in America, in the South, that is, have Black ancestry, right? Now, that is something that any intelligent mind could grasp. Why? Even without even doing that, well, we would, probably would not know it was over 90%, but we would know that you have had Black people or people of African descent living in that country since the 17th century, along with people of European heritage or ancestry. So do you think that there was going to be pure, with all of the raping and the human interaction that occurred from those centuries past up to now, that you'd have so-called pure white people living in the United States? And there are people going to do their DNA testing. Science is flawed. You have to understand that, yes, it can give you an understanding, but it cannot. The human system is so complex that science has not even yet begun to unravel the complexity of this human organ or organism that we call the body. Right? So yes, you can go to have your DNA testing and come on YouTube and tell me that you're X% Nigerian and 5% Ghanaian and whatever you are. Right? And it's okay if you feel good about, if that makes you feel good about yourself. More power to you. But don't think that this is carved in stone and this is all about you. Because there are lots of things that might be hidden that science cannot reveal because it doesn't have that power to do so. Right? And that's why we should try to treat, yes, it's okay when you do know to acknowledge it, that you know that you have Nigerian heritage, or you have, Italian heritage, or British, or whatever, right? But it just makes you a better person, right? These things don't make you a better person. It might help you to sort of understand, because sometimes in order to understand our health, we have to go back to our, past DNA and see what was going on in our families, what illnesses might have been prevalent in that family, in that ethnic group, etc., etc. But it's not going to help you to make you a better person, a more morally upright person, a more educated person. It doesn't do anything at all. Right? And we need to understand that. Right? As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says, we should be judged by the moral content of our characters, not by these external things that we're seeing, whether you're brown or we're different shades of brown. That is, right? We're not black or white or. And what is this? Why would people who say they're white, why would you want to be white? I don't think whiteness as a color would fit well with the human face. If I see a person who is what I regard as white, I would run away from them. Right? I really don't understand. And when you speak to US citizens, especially those who are, of European heritage, this sort of obsession, it's an obsession with being white. Right? And what does it say? I just see you as a normal human being. And as I said, the Bible says that it's from one blood that he has made all the nations of the world to dwell. All the nations that we are seeing here, who look in some cases different, is God who did it. He made it that way. Right? And there are lots of mysteries to it. When we look at the animal kingdom, lots of mysteries to even the animal kingdom. Right? The lion that lives in Asia, looks a little different from the lion that lives on the African continent. Right? Or perhaps who might live on the European continent. Right? Right? And it stands for all animals. It bears true for all animals. And if they see each other, if the lion from Asia should meet the lion in Africa, they know that they're lions. They roar, right? And they behave that, maybe they have a little bit different characteristics, respond to the climate and the weather differently, right? And they appear to physically a little different, but they know that they are lions. And lions, they are, right? So why do we as human beings who have a brain, right, to whom God has endowed understanding of what rational thought is about, why do we behave the way we do? And we begin to divide ourselves, right? And if somebody doesn't use a particular word, it means that they don't understand what we believe or what we think, right? People are allowed to have different perspectives and should be allowed to have different perspectives in a democratic society. I end here by saying, right? When Samuel, was the prophet over the Israelites, over the Jews, right? And God was their king. And when God ruled them as their king, Israel was perhaps the most prosperous nation in the world, on the planet. They were in every sphere of their lives, right? And they watched other nations, that's the Israelites, the Jews, watched other nations, neighboring countries around them, neighboring nations. And they saw that these neighboring nations had kings, human kings, that is, because they had a king, but God was their king. And of course, they weren't seeing God physical. So they said, well, we want a tangible king, a king that we can see, we can look at, we can touch, right? And Samuel was offended because Samuel was saying, God has done so much for you guys, and you want a human king to rule over you? I mean, his heart was broken. Okay? He went to God, and God, as a democratic king, at least here on this earth, because he knows that this world, because of sin, partly belongs to the devil, right? And he said to Samuel, let them, give them what they desire, right? Because that's what democracy is all about. It was offensive to God. It was offensive to Samuel and to any well-thinking person that a people of inferior intelligence and inferior stock would prefer, I should say, a human king of inferior intelligence, right? Whether it's the Obamas, nobody, no human being can be compared to God. We're dust, right? But people tend to be impressed with what they see. And when they see these frivolous, and superficial, decorations of a palace, right? Wow, I would like to be like that person, right? And that is what they did. They saw where it seemed to be that these people were happy. It seemed that they were happy to crown their king and to pay him homage, right? And they preferred to pay that human king or those human kings homage over God. And what happened to them eventually, of course, we knew the history was horrendous, that their kings exploited them, right? And took advantage of them, right? And brought them into apostasy, right? So we have to be careful of paying homage, right? To kings, to presidents, to prime ministers, right? We've got to understand that these people, they are just humans as we are. And they have feet of clay just like we do. Why do we therefore, give them such level of, respect, sometimes higher than we give to God? Right? So I just wanted to bring this to the fore, to your understanding that it's time for you to wake up Nikki Haley, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, any political leaders around the world, in the United States as well as around the world, have a right to espouse any doctrines that they choose to. It is their fundamental right, their right to express themselves freely and openly. Right? So if Nikki Haley believes that slavery was not the principal cause of this US Civil War, then that is her right. And there's no way the papers, whether the UK Guardian or the Washington Post or the New York Times, have that right. They can correct her, but they don't have the right to, um, you know, to coerce her to believe what they want her to believe, or the perspective that they desire that she has. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. All the best to you. Happy New Year. Bye.